The first thing you noticed about Hannah Clarke was that she didn't seem to be there at all. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors like water finding the lowest path, necessary and unremarkable. Her scrubs hung slightly loose on a frame that suggested she forgot to eat on most Tuesdays. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in that particular frequency that only nurses seemed to hear anymore, a sound like electrical insects trapped in glass. She kept her badge clipped low, almost hidden beneath the fabric of her top. Her name tag read Hannah Clarke, RN. Nothing more. Nothing about the 12 years. Nothing about the 3 tours. Nothing about the weight she carried in hands that had learned to be steady when everything around her was collapsing. It was 6:22 a.m. on a Tuesday when Captain Marcus Webb arrived at Oak Creek Memorial. He came in on a stretcher, unconscious, his military ID marking him as Navy, training accident during a routine exercise at the port. Blunt force trauma to the thorax. Multiple contusions. Possible pneumothorax. The attending physicians moved with the choreography of practiced emergency medicine, orders called out, monitors connected, vital signs climbed onto the whiteboard. Hannah watched from the corner where good nurses learn to position themselves. Invisible. Present. Ready. The captain was being prepped for room 347, one of the monitored bays, and the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who had been at Oak Creek for 14 years, caught Hannah's eye. "Can you handle initial vitals and for setup?" "He's still sedated." Hannah nodded once. Just once. No unnecessary movement. No unnecessary words. Room 347 was like every other room in the critical care unit. Pale blue walls that had been chosen by a committee decades ago. A monitor with 12 leads ready to be attached. For poles standing like metal trees waiting for fluids to hang from their branches. The captain lay on the hospital bed with the stillness of deep sedation, his chest rising and falling in sync with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. Hannah pulled on fresh gloves, the snap of latex against her wrists sharp and precise, and began her assessment. Temperature probe. Blood pressure cuff. Pulse oximeter clipped to his index finger. Her hands moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory so deep it lives in the bones themselves. She didn't think about what she was doing. She simply did it. The way you breathe. The way your heart beats. The way your hands know exactly how much pressure to apply to a human arm without thinking. Captain Webb's face was unremarkable in sedation. His features slack, softened by medication that kept him from fighting the breathing tube in his throat. Hannah adjusted his head position to prevent aspiration and found herself studying his face for a fraction of a second longer than protocol required. Something flickered in her mind, a connection her conscious brain couldn't quite reach. She pushed it away. Old instinct. Old habit. The mind sometimes tries to rebuild patterns from 20 years ago, even when those years have been deliberately buried. She checked the foresight where the 18-gauge catheter had been placed during transport. Blood return good. No infiltration. She made a note on the chart. Time 0651. Vital stable. Patient sedated. She would check on him every hour like she checked on all the others. No different. No special attention. No reason for anyone to notice anything unusual about the way her breathing had become slightly shallow. The locker room was at the end of the third-floor corridor, past the staff bathroom and the medication storage closet. It smelled like industrial cleaner and the faint decay of a space where dozens of people left pieces of their lives behind each shift. Hannah's locker was number 247, down in the corner where the shadows seemed deeper. She pulled open the metal door and there they were, exactly where she'd left them on her second day at Oak Creek Memorial, a pair of boots. Combat boots. Size 9. Tan desert coloring faded now to the color of old sand. The leather was creased and scarred. The laces were gone, replaced with paracord in a specific knot pattern. She had wrapped them in clear plastic 2 months ago, layering it carefully the way you'd preserve evidence or a relic. Beneath the plastic, if you looked closely, you could still see the dust. Not Houston dust. Not Texas dust. Ramadi dust. the dust of a place her body remembered better than her mind wanted to admit. Hannah stared at them for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't touch them. She never touched them anymore. The last time she'd worn these boots was on a day in 2004 when the Jolan district was burning and she had pulled a child from a pile of concrete and rebar in his own blood, a boy no more than 8 years old who was crying in Arabic that she couldn't understand but whose fear needed no translation. She had carried him 14 blocks to the medical station and his weight in her arms had felt like the entire war condensing into something she could physically hold. She had saved his life. Watched him transferred. Never knew his name. Never knew what happened to him after that. Some wars you carry forever. Some you wrap in plastic and hide in locker 247 and try not to think about while you're making hospital rounds in a city that's never heard a mortar fall. She pushed the locker closed. The metal clang of it echoed in the empty room like a small violence. No one was there to hear it. She was alone. She was always alone before the shift started. Dr. Sterling entered the critical care unit at 7:15 a.m., his white coat still crisp from the dry cleaner, his presence preceding him like a pressure wave. He was a man built for authority the way some men are built for height. It showed in the way his spine remained perfectly straight, the way his eyes scanned rooms as if assessing which corners belonged to him. He had been the chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial for 9 years, a position he maintained through a careful architecture of board connections, social events with the hospital administrator's wife, and the kind of strategic friendships that made difficult questions disappear before they could be asked out loud. His credentials were respectable. His medical judgment was adequate. His humanity was something he had traded away at some point and never bothered to retrieve. He moved through the unit checking charts, speaking in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to instant obedience. Most of the nurses scattered slightly when he appeared, a subtle repositioning of bodies and attention. Hannah did not scatter. She continued her work with the same precise, measured movement she'd maintained since arriving at the hospital. She was charting vitals from her morning rounds when Dr. Sterling appeared at the nursing station, his eyes tracking her movement as she wrote. He watched her with the kind of attention a hunter gives prey it hasn't yet decided whether to pursue or to eliminate. "New nurse," he said, more observation than greeting. His voice carried the flat effect of someone for whom normal human inflection felt like an unnecessary expense. "Hannah Clarke, RN." Her response was immediate, professional, deferential in the particular way that nurses learn to be when speaking to doctors. She had perfected this version of herself. Helpful but not presumptuous. Competent but not threatening. Visible but not memorable. Started when? 2 months. Med-Surg rotation, transferred to critical care 4 weeks ago. "You're efficient." He said it the way someone might note that a tool was sharp. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation of potential utility or potential threat. He was still watching her, his eyes moving across her face as if he were looking for something. "Ever work in a combat zone?" The question landed precisely. Hannah's hands did not falter. Her pen continued moving across the chart. Her voice remained level and low. "No, sir. Never have." "Interesting." Dr. Sterling turned and walked away before the silence could become uncomfortable. "Keep up the work ethic. Hospital needs nurses who know their place." Hannah exhaled slowly through her nose. She had become expert at this particular form of breathing, the kind that no one could see, that didn't disturb the surface of things. Around her, the hospital continued its ordinary functions. Monitor alarms periodically. Phone calls. The squeak of a stretcher being moved down the hall. The hiss of the automated door opening for a transport team. Room 347 continued its steady work of keeping Captain Marcus Webb alive, the machines breathing for him, the medications flowing through his four at precisely controlled rates. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would come later, when Hannah would understand exactly how much Dr. Sterling had seen in that moment of observation, and how little she had understood about the quiet danger of being noticed by a man whose power came not from what he could do, but from what he could unmake. The worst part would be the realization that she had been invisible for so long that she had forgotten how visible she could become. The worst part would be understanding that the boots in her locker, the boots wrapped in plastic and hidden in the shadows of 247, meant something very different to the people in this hospital than they meant to her. They meant evidence. They meant history. They meant questions that Hannah Clarke had spent 20 years learning how to keep buried. For now, at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Houston, she simply adjusted Captain Webb's pillows, checked the ventilator settings, and moved on to the next patient, her hand steady as surgical steel. The morning staff meeting started at 7:30. Dr. Sterling leaned back in his chair at the head of the conference table, his posture a study in manufactured authority, and waited for the room to settle before speaking. Hannah sat in the third row, her hands folded on the table in front of her, listening to the usual briefings about bed capacity and discharge procedures. Then Sterling's voice changed, dropped lower, took on that tone that made her stomach tighten. "I'll bet a month's salary," he announced, loud enough that everyone stopped writing, "that our new little nurse quits within a week. She's got that look, you know? Like a scared rabbit caught in headlights." His gaze flicked toward Hannah just long enough for her to feel it land. "I give her 5 days. Maybe 6 if she's stubborn." Laughter rippled through the conference room like water spreading across tile. It was the kind of laughter that fed on itself, that grew louder because everyone could feel permission in it, permission to agree, to underestimate, to dismiss. A resident smiled. A cardiac nurse laughed outright. Sterling watched the room respond to his words the way a conductor watches an orchestra obey his baton, and his smile widened. Hannah took one measured breath. She didn't look up. She didn't clench her fist or press her nails into her palms. Instead, she let a single tear escape from her left eye, not from sadness, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of carrying 20 years of silence. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the table in front of her, and she said nothing. The silence that followed was different from the laughter. It was the silence of people who had seen something they didn't have words for. Sterling's jaw tightened. He didn't like silence. He preferred it when he could control the conversation, control the response, control what happened next. He turned away and moved on to the next agenda item, but the meeting had changed. Everyone could feel it. Hannah had done nothing, and everything had shifted. By that afternoon, Sterling's humiliation had begun to fester. Humiliation at a man like that is like pouring acid on a wound. It doesn't heal, it only spreads. He found her in the cafeteria at 12:45, standing in line with a tray. She'd chosen salad, minestrone soup, coffee in a paper cup. Nothing elaborate. Nothing that required attention. He walked past her table deliberately, his shoulder nearly brushing hers, and knocked the tray from her hands with the casual precision of someone who'd done this exact thing before, muscle memory for cruelty. The salad scattered. The soup exploded across the tile floor in an arc of red broth, steaming hot, spreading in every direction. The coffee cup shattered, sending brown liquid and ceramic shards across the white floor in a pattern that looked almost choreographed. People turned. Phone cameras flickered. Sterling stepped over the wreckage like it was nothing, like it was debris beneath his notice, and his voice carried across the cafeteria. "Clumsy little thing, aren't you? Maybe you should stick to mopping instead of thinking you belong in a uniform." Hannah knelt slowly. She began collecting the pieces of ceramic, the large chunks first, then the smaller ones, then the fragments so small they caught the light. A soaked napkin in her other hand. Around her, people watched. Nobody helped. Nobody moved. Sterling's cronies stood near the coffee station, phones down now, just watching to see what she would do. Watching to see if she would break. She stood. Her voice, when it came, had the quality of still water, perfectly calm, perfectly level, the kind of calm that came from having already survived things that would destroy most people. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through enemy fire, Doctor. I think I can manage a cafeteria tray." She dropped the broken ceramic into the trash, the napkin following, and walked past him without looking at his face. "I'm going on break," she added quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. The room went dead silent. Sterling's face flushed, not the red of embarrassment, but the darker red of rage compressed into a human shape. She had done something worse than break. She had responded with dignity. She had proven, in front of 20 hospital staff members, that his insult had not landed the way he intended. That she was not a scared rabbit. That whatever he was, whatever power he wielded with his phone calls and his board connections and his surgical credentials, she had seen worse. She had survived worse. And she was still standing. He watched her walk toward the exit, her posture unchanged, her pace steady. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. The sound of the dishwashing station clattering in the background. The smell of industrial cleaner mixing with the ghost of spilled soup. Sterling's hands clenched into fists at his sides. 2 days later, the real escalation began. Hannah was working the ER trauma section, a section she'd transferred into specifically to be closer to Captain Webb's recovery, though nobody knew that. Sterling appeared at 4:15 in the afternoon with a chart in his hands, Webb's latest lab work and imaging results. He approached her at the nursing station in front of the entire staff, nurses, techs, residents, 2 visiting medical students. He held the chart at arm's length and dropped it at her feet like it was contaminated. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice was pleasant, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "When I want your opinion on treatment protocols, I'll ask. But I never will. You understand me? You're a bed monitor. Nothing more. You follow protocols. You don't think. You don't improvise. You certainly don't make decisions." The chart landed with a slap. Hannah bent, retrieved it, and straightened. She didn't say anything. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply walked away, holding the chart the way a soldier holds orders, with the kind of acceptance that comes from knowing that responding would only make things worse. But Sterling's humiliation was festering now, spreading like an infection. He could feel her competence like a threat. He could feel her quiet strength like a reproach. That night, something changed in the hospital. The administration got a call from Dr. Sterling at home, urgent enough that the board president took it even though it was past 10 o'clock. There were concerns about Hannah's credentials, Sterling explained. Gaps in her background check. Inconsistencies in her references that he'd discovered. Nothing provable, nothing concrete, but troubling. Concerning. The kind of thing that required investigation. By the next morning, an external auditor was already being contacted. By the morning after that, Hannah's personnel file had been flagged for formal review. Sterling had shifted his strategy. He wasn't breaking her with insults anymore. Now he was using institutional power, the kind of power that doesn't respond to dignity, that doesn't care about how calmly you answer back. The kind of power that works in phone calls and administrative forms and investigations that take months to resolve. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what would change everything. Because what happened next arrived at 2:47 in the morning, in room 347, where Captain Marcus Webb's chest tube dislodged and his oxygen saturation plummeted toward 0, and Hannah, the quiet nurse with the buried past and the hidden boots in her locker, would prove exactly who she was. Dr. Sterling made the call at 11:53 on a Thursday night, his voice smooth as oil poured over gravel. The hospital board president picked up on the 4th ring, irritated at first, then listening. Sterling spoke about credential gaps, about questionable references, about a nurse who seemed to materialize from nowhere with no verifiable employment history for the past 7 years. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone carried the weight of a man who controlled something the board president wanted: access, approval, the subtle machinery of institutional power that kept hospitals running and administrators comfortable. By morning, the external investigator had arrived. Her name was Dr. Patricia Cole, and she moved through Oak Creek Memorial with the precision of someone trained to find problems whether they existed or not. She asked Sterling leading questions in his office. She pulled Hannah's file, the thin one that showed her nursing license, her certifications, her 12 years of spotless employment at a clinic that had mysteriously closed for years ago. She requested references. When those came back glowing but vague, she noted it. Cole was good at her job. She was good at finding threads to pull. She was also, unbeknownst to Sterling, deeply loyal to the people who paid her consulting fees, and Sterling had authorized a check that morning, $15,000 for what he called a thorough review. The paperwork arrived at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Suspended pending investigation. The language was clinical, detached, the kind of terminology designed to strip dignity from a single page. Hannah read it at her locker, her hand steady, her breathing level, her jaw a single hard line as she removed her name badge and placed it on the shelf beside her phone. The combat boots she had carried in a grocery bag, unable to leave them behind, unwilling to display them. Around her, other nurses whispered. Some avoided her eyes. Some looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been relief that it wasn't them. Security arrived at 2:27. A man named Rodriguez with kind eyes and an uncomfortable expression, his radio clipped to his belt, his badge catching the fluorescent lights like a mirror. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He simply walked beside her toward the exit, past the emergency department where 3 days ago she had thrown a patient chart to the floor and been called sweetheart by a man who thought words were weapons. She saw Dr. Sterling watching from the administrative corridor on the second floor, his arms crossed against his chest, his expression holding something between satisfaction and hunger. He had orchestrated this. He had made the calls, sent the emails, activated the machinery. He had won the first round. She left her locker cleaned out by 4 o'clock. The grocery bag containing the combat boots was heavier than it should have been, the weight of 2 decades, of secrets, of a past that refused to stay buried. She drove home in silence, the air conditioning humming like distant machinery, and sat in her apartment in the darkness without turning on the lights. The walls were bare. The furniture was minimal. Her life had been constructed to be erasable, and she had succeeded. There was nothing in that apartment that said who she had been, and now there was nothing in the hospital that said who she was. But she couldn't stay away. On the 3rd day of her suspension, Hannah sat in the Veterans Affairs Medical Center waiting room with a clipboard in her hands and a lie on her lips. She had walked in at 9:15 in the morning, had filled out just enough of the intake form to get past the receptionist, had claimed she was there for a routine physical. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and something older, the smell of men and women who had been broken and were slowly learning to be whole again. Around her sat a veteran with a prosthetic arm, his phone in his remaining hand, texting with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from adaptation. 2 rows over, a woman in a wheelchair stared at the wall calendar as if it might contain answers. Hannah recognized her, Martinez, a former hospital volunteer from her EMT rotation, back when she was supposed to be invisible. The intake form asked about service record. It asked for dates. It asked for branch and rank and deployment history. Hannah's pen hovered over the paper. She couldn't write it. Writing it would make it real. Writing it would create a paper trail. Writing it would be an admission that existed outside her control, outside her ability to manage or contain or bury. She looked at the blank lines and felt something crack inside her chest, not pain, not quite, but pressure. The pressure of water held back by a dam that had begun to show its first hairline fracture. She left the form crumpled on the chair and walked out at 10:42. That night, she couldn't sleep. At 11:15, she was sitting in her car in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot, staring at the main entrance where security cameras rotated on their mounts like mechanical sentries. She knew the codes. Her badge had been deactivated, but the magnetic locks didn't always update in real time. There was usually a lag of 6 to 8 hours, sometimes longer if the night shift supervisor hadn't processed the termination yet. She knew the nurse schedules. She knew that Captain Webb would be sleeping in room 347 on the orthopedic wing, under observation, recovering from the surgery that had saved his life and simultaneously destroyed hers. She needed to see him one more time. The employee entrance on the east side of the hospital had a door that opened to the physical therapy corridor. Hannah used her badge at 11:30, and the lock clicked open. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was level. This was reconnaissance. This was one final verification that nothing had changed, that the world was still turning as it should. She moved through the corridors with the muscle memory of someone who had walked these halls thousands of times, nodding to the night nurses who didn't recognize her out of context, slipping through the service corridor that connected orthopedics to the main patient wing. Room 347 was dark except for the glow of the cardiac monitor, its rhythm a steady beep-beep-beep that sounded like a heartbeat translated into sound. Captain Webb was sleeping, his jaw relaxed, his breathing deep and even. A good sign. His oxygen saturation was 98%. His blood pressure stable at 116/73. She adjusted his blanket, a small gesture, the kind a nurse performs 10,000 times without thinking, and allowed herself 30 seconds of looking at him. 20 years she had carried his face in her memory. 8 years old, covered in dust from a collapsed building in Jolan district, his eyes the color of burned coffee, his small hand gripping hers as she pulled him from the rubble. She had named him then, in her head, the boy she would never see again, the one who had taught her that saving a life meant carrying it forever. And then he had appeared here, grown into a captain of the Navy, and the universe had decided that cruelty was a thing that could be distributed equally across time. The door opened behind her. The sound registered first, not the soft hiss of an automatic closer, but the scrape of a key card, deliberate and slow. Hannah turned. The man in the doorway wore a ski mask pulled down over his face and held a knife that caught the light from the cardiac monitor, the blade a thin silver line against the darkness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his movements carried the kind of practiced ease that came from knowing how to use the weapon in his hand. Not a random attack. Not desperation. This was orchestrated. "Step back from the patient," he said. His voice was muffled but steady. Slowly. Hannah stepped forward instead. The knife came at her waist, a thrust meant to separate her from the bed, and her body moved without consulting her mind. Her hands came up to trap his wrist against her ribs, and the blade punched into her abdomen anyway because she had angled her body to protect the bed, to shield Captain Webb, to position herself between a weapon and a man who had been asleep 30 seconds ago. The pain was information. Pain is data. She had learned this in Ramadi, where shrapnel taught the body to prioritize and compartmentalize and continue functioning. The knife came out. It went in again, and she felt it slide between ribs, felt the sickening sensation of tissue parting, and still she held his wrist, still she did not release, still she kept herself between the blade and the man behind her. "Get security," she shouted, her voice like a command that had never learned to ask politely. The night nurse outside the room heard her and ran, and Hannah felt her legs beginning to abandon her, felt gravity becoming complicated, felt the floor rising up like a tide. She was falling. She was pulling the attacker toward her as she fell, using his own momentum against him, ending this the way soldiers end things, with the last ounce of purpose before the lights go black. The knife came first. That's what Hannah would remember later, not the man, not the mask, but the blade itself, how it caught the fluorescent light as it rose above Captain Webb's unconscious form like a question being asked in steel. The intruder moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had done this before, who understood the geometry of violence the way Hannah understood the anatomy of survival. 3 a.m. The hospital corridor was empty. The machines around Webb's bed beeped their steady rhythm, oblivious. The man's gloved hand gripped the bed rail. His breathing was controlled. Professional. He wore a ski mask and dark scrubs, hospital clothes, which meant he'd walked past at least for checkpoints without triggering alarm. Which meant someone had told him where Webb slept. Hannah had made it 3 days without returning to Oak Creek Memorial. 3 days of sitting in her apartment with the combat boots on her lap, staring at the laces still crusted with Iraqi dust, unable to throw them away but unable to keep them either. 3 days of not calling the VA hospital, not asking about Webb, not doing anything but exist in the liminal space between the nurse she'd pretended to be and the soldier she'd tried to bury. But at 2:16 a.m. on day 4, something broke open in her chest, not panic, something sharper than that. Instinct. The kind that had kept her alive through 14 hours of mortar fire at FOB Laguna. She'd thrown on scrubs, driven through empty streets, and used her old hospital badge. Security hadn't updated the system yet. to slip into the tower where Webb was recovering. Just to check. Just to see him breathing. She was walking past room 347 when the world compressed into a single second of pure clarity. The intruder heard her footsteps. He turned, blade still raised, and for a moment Hannah saw herself in the mask's empty eye holes, a ghost in scrubs, a woman who had no business being here, no authority to stop what was about to happen. He moved toward her, not to engage but to eliminate the witness, the blade already arcing downward with the kind of speed that comes from muscle memory. Hannah didn't think. Thinking gets you killed. She stepped into the attack instead of away from it, closing the distance so the knife couldn't gain velocity, and in that compressed space between her ribs and his chest, she became something other than a nurse. Her hands moved on their own, driving him toward the bed, using his own momentum the way she'd been taught to do 20 years ago when momentum was everything and hesitation meant death. Get away from him. Her voice came out like still water over stone. The blade punched into her abdomen once, a white-hot shock of pain that stole her breath. She didn't scream. She pivoted, twisted, tried to disarm him, and the knife came free and went in again, this time lower. This time she felt something give that shouldn't have. Pain was information. Pain was data. The second wound told her she was bleeding into her peritoneal cavity and had maybe minutes before her pressure dropped critically. It told her she needed to end this now. She screamed then, not from pain but as a weapon, a sound designed to trigger alarm response in the sleeping hospital, and it worked. Alarms shrieked to life. Code blue lights flashed in the hallway. The intruder shoved her away from the bed, sending her crashing into the cardiac monitor, and ran. Captain Webb's eyes snapped open. He was still groggy from sedation, still tethered to fours and monitoring lines, but his military instincts overrode the confusion. He saw Hannah. He saw the blood spreading across her white scrubs in an expanding crimson bloom. He saw her knees buckle as her body finally processed what her mind had refused to acknowledge. He screamed her name, or tried to, his voice cracked and desperate, and reached for her as she fell backward toward the tile floor. She didn't fall alone. Webb, still tangled in his own lines, caught her, cradling her head as alarms screamed and fluorescent lights blazed overhead. Her blood pooled on the white tile in spreading, glossy circles. It was warm. It was his fault she was here. Everything was his fault. Security burst through the door, weapons drawn, but Hannah was already somewhere else. The pain had moved from sharp to distant, muffled, like she was hearing it through water. She felt Webb's hands shaking as they pressed against her wound, trying to stop the bleeding, and his voice calling for a nurse, calling for help, calling for anyone to fix what had just happened to the woman who had fixed everything. Through the fog, she heard him whisper a single word. Nightingale. It was barely audible. A prayer. A recognition. His eyes were wide, searching her face like he was trying to align the grown woman bleeding into his hands with the memory of a corpsman in desert camo, the woman who had pulled him from rubble when he was small enough to carry, when his name was not yet Webb but still just a boy whose skin was caked in ash. His mouth opened. His hands moved to her face. You're the woman who, but the EMTs were already there, 2 paramedics with the fluid efficiency of people who understood trauma, who understood that talking was a luxury they couldn't afford. They loaded her onto a stretcher with practice speed. They already had her blood type from her employee records, O negative, universal donor. The irony was not lost on anyone. As they wheeled her from the room toward the elevator, toward surgery, toward the next several hours of controlled crisis, Webb made a call. He dialed a number that had been tattooed on his memory for 2 decades. Naval Intelligence. A direct line that wasn't supposed to exist but did, the kind of number you carried with you after ops in hostile territory, the kind you called when something broke that no local authority could fix. He gave them the hospital name. He gave them the patient codes. He gave them the name of the nurse who had just taken 2 stab wounds for him, the woman who had been his corpsman, who had carried him through enemy fire, who had then disappeared into civilian life like she'd never worn the uniform at all. Within 18 minutes, ACR-17 landed at Ellington Field. Within 35 minutes, 4 naval intelligence officers were in the Oak Creek Memorial lobby with federal warrant authority. Within 42 minutes, Dr. Sterling was being woken up at home by a phone call that began with the words, "Sir, this is Special Agent Morrison with NCIS. We need you at your hospital immediately." Sterling arrived at 4:03 a.m., disheveled and furious, his authority-like armor as he strode into the restricted floor. He saw the uniforms and something in his chest tightened. "This is a hospital matter," he began, already calculating which board members he needed to call, which lawyers would take his money, which narrative might still be salvaged. "Not military." The lead officer, a commander with a chest full of ribbons, turned slowly to face him. His expression was the kind you wore when delivering bad news to the families of the deceased. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke is a decorated combat veteran," he said, and the way he said Senior Chief made it clear that Hannah's rank outweighed Sterling's authority by several orders of magnitude. "This is now a federal investigation." Sterling's face drained of color. He tried to speak. Found nothing to say. In recovery, as anesthesia was being titrated down and Hannah's eyes flickered open to fluorescent brightness and the beeping of her own monitors, her own pressure and her own heart rate and her own oxygen saturation, she found herself surrounded by dress uniforms. A Navy commander. 2 SEAL team officers with the kind of eyes that had seen things that shouldn't exist in the world. Captain Webb in a wheelchair beside her bed, his face wet with tears. An officer was reading from her personnel file with hands that trembled slightly as he spoke her name in full, the way they did at deployments, the way they did at promotions, the way they did at ceremonies where people received medals for the things they did when no one was watching. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Marie Clarke," the commander began, and the room went still as stone. The commander's voice continued steady, each word landing like a gavel strike. 3 Purple Hearts. 2 Bronze Stars. He paused, letting the weight settle. Then, and a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in Ramadi. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was the kind of silence that holds the entire hospital up by its throat. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped its lonely rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like machinery grinding through time itself. Hannah's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling tile above her bed. The pain in her abdomen had morphed into something manageable now, the morphine doing its work, but her mind was perfectly clear. She could hear the shift in the room's temperature, the way the air pressure changed when Truth walked in. Dr. Sterling had left hours ago. She'd watched him go, escorted by hospital security with his jaw locked tight like a man swallowing glass. The commander continued. "Senior Chief Clarke's service record spans 23 years. 14 overseas deployments. 8 combat tours." He turned a page in the file. His hands weren't shaking anymore. In 2004, while assigned to Naval Medical Support Unit Ramadi, she performed emergency stabilization procedures on 47 trauma casualties over a 72-hour period during the insurgent offensive on Route Michigan. He looked up from the file. The Navy Cross citation states, "For extraordinary heroism in the face of direct enemy fire while maintaining command of a deteriorating medical facility." A man in dress blue stepped forward from the back of the room. Captain Marcus Webb stood there, but it was another figure that moved into Hannah's line of sight, a SEAL Team 3 operator, his face weathered the way only combat does it, his shoulders carrying the particular weight of someone who'd seen colleagues die in the dirt. His name tag read Breaker. His eyes were wet. "Senior Chief Clarke," he began, and his voice was different from the commander's, rougher, like it had been dragged across concrete and pieced back together. "I was there that night in Ramadi. 23 of us made it out of that hospital alive because of her." He swallowed. "She held that facility together for 14 hours while mortars came through the roof. Shrapnel took out our backup generator. We had one surgical light, and she operated by that single source while rounds hit the walls around us. She didn't flinch. Not once." Hannah felt her throat tighten. The monitors registered the change, her heart rate climbing from 62 to 71. Breaker stepped closer to the bed. There was a kid. 8 years old. Shattered tibia and fibula, massive hemorrhage. She ran a battlefield tourniquet, gotten 4 in his arm under fire, calculated his fluid replacement manually because our pumps were down. That kid is standing here in this room right now as a Navy captain. Breaker's voice cracked slightly. She pulled him out of rubble in 2004. Saved his life twice, once in the rubble, once more in that hospital. Then she walked away from all of it and nobody ever knew. The door to Hannah's room opened. A woman in marine dress blues entered, her face lined with the particular intensity of someone who worked in cybersecurity and had seen things on screens that made most people's blood run cold. She carried a laptop. The nameplate read Martinez. The external investigator Dr. Sterling brought in. Martinez said, and the tone of her voice was the tone of someone laying out a precision bombing run. Found no credential issues with Senior Chief Clarke. Her nursing licenses are clean. Her continuing education is current. She opened the laptop. However, the investigator did find discrepancies in Dr. Sterling's records. 3 years of falsified CME credits. Continuing medical education hours that never happened. He forged attendance signatures from conferences in Las Vegas, Miami, and San Diego, all dates when he was documented as being in Houston. The commander's face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Martinez continued, the board president he contacted, Dr. Richard Ashford, received a subpoena for text messages. They're damning. Sterling texted him on May 14, that Clarke woman is making me look bad in front of the attending staff. She's too competent. It's a threat. Then, I need her gone within 2 weeks. Can you help? Then, critically, don't ask questions about the mechanism. Just make it happen. Martinez turned the laptop around. On screen, photographs of text message threads. Conspiracy. Documented, time-stamped, undeniable. Captain Webb provided a statement, the commander said quietly, detailing how his care was restricted after Senior Chief Clarke's suspension. How Sterling explicitly denied her visitor access before the stabbing. How Sterling was present in the hallway when the attacker fled and did nothing to pursue or stop him. The words hung in the air like smoke. Hannah turned her head slightly toward the window. Outside, Houston's skyline caught the late afternoon light, all those buildings full of people who never knew what it cost to hold things together when everything was coming apart. Hospital legal is calculating liability, Martinez said. She didn't sound sorry about it. She sounded like she was reading a casualty report. One decorated war hero. Wrongfully suspended. Stabbed on hospital premises while that suspension was in effect. The board convened an emergency session this morning. They voted unanimously to terminate Dr. Sterling's position as Chief of Surgery, effective immediately. His medical license is under review by the Texas Medical Board. The state is investigating fraud charges related to the falsified CME credits. Breaker walked to the window. His network abandons fast, he said quietly. I made some calls to people who used to vouch for him. 3 of them independently told me they received calls from Sterling trying to poison his recommendations on you. They're not going to lie for him now. Nobody wants to be next. It took less than 2 weeks. That was the real shock of it, not that Sterling fell, but that he fell so completely. A man whose entire career had been built on institutional hierarchy, on favor trading and board connections, watched it all dissolve like watercolor in rain. The hospital's IT director, Martinez, had preserved every frame of security footage. Sterling knocking the lunch tray from Hannah's hands. Sterling throwing Captain Webb's chart at her feet. Sterling standing in the ER doorway, watching without moving as hospital security escorted Hannah out of the building. He lost his position. Lost his credibility. Lost his references. Within 2 weeks, he was unemployable in Houston medicine. No hospital would touch him. No surgical group would have him. The man who'd spent 27 years climbing the ladder found himself at the bottom, looking at a long fall with nothing to break it. Hannah recovered slowly. 8 weeks post-op, the incisions on her abdomen were healing cleanly. The surgical team at Houston Methodist had been meticulous, but she still felt the phantom pressure when she moved too quickly. The morphine had been tapered down and then off entirely. Her mind had returned completely from the haze, crystal clear and remembering everything, the taste of blood, the weight of Captain Webb's uniform when she collapsed against him, the way his voice sounded when he whispered her old call sign. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting on her apartment balcony, looking out at a stretch of Houston that didn't show you the river but implied it was there, somewhere in the distance. The number on her phone screen was unfamiliar, but the voice that answered was professional, measured, important. Senior Chief Clarke? This is the White House Office of Presidential Correspondence. The woman on the line spoke the way people speak when they're delivering news that will change the architecture of a life. The president has selected you as a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal. The ceremony is scheduled for 3 months from today in the Rose Garden. Do you accept? Hannah didn't speak immediately. Outside, Houston's traffic hummed its endless current. Sirens in the distance. The sound of a city that kept moving forward whether you were ready or not. I accept, she said quietly. 3 months later, Hannah stood in the Rose Garden wearing her dress blues for the first time in 15 years. The uniform felt different on her body now, not like a skin she'd shed, but like a skin she was reclaiming. The left arm was still slightly stiff from the stab wounds, but the sling had come off 3 weeks prior. She could feel the strength returning, day by day, through physical therapy and swimming and the stubborn refusal to accept that her body would remain diminished. The president placed the medal around her neck. The weight of it was real, not metaphorical, not ceremonial, but an actual physical presence against her chest. Behind her were the people she'd saved. 12 of them. 23 had been in that hospital in Ramadi, and 12 had made it back to the United States, and they were all here now, standing in a line in the Rose Garden, watching her. Captain Marcus Webb stood at attention in the front row, in his Navy service dress blues, his captain's bars glinting in the afternoon light. He saluted her. Not as a subordinate to a superior officer, they didn't have that relationship anymore, but as one warrior to another. As someone who'd been pulled out of rubble as a child and given a second life, saluting the woman who'd made it possible. Breaker was there too, SEAL Team 3 tattoo visible on his neck, his eyes the color of the Atlantic during a storm. He'd brought 6 other operators with him, men and women Hannah had worked alongside in 2004, when the world was on fire and they'd made a choice to hold the line anyway. The citation read, "For extraordinary service to the United States and for her compassionate dedication to saving lives both in theater and in civilian practice, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Marie Clarke is awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal." The cameras flashed like distant artillery. Hannah's hands didn't shake. Her composure held like it always did, because that was what 15 years of carrying secrets had taught her, how to stand perfectly still while the world exploded around her. Except the world wasn't exploding anymore. It was finally, after 2 decades, coming into focus. She looked down. On her feet were the same worn combat boots from Ramadi. The leather was cracked, creased, faded from 2 decades of being stored in darkness. The soles were worn smooth from all that running, all that fighting, all that staying alive. When she'd laced them up that morning, tears had come, not tears of pain or shame, but tears of recognition. The boots had seen everything. And now the world saw them too. That night, at the reception following the ceremony, Hannah gave an interview to a major news outlet. The reporter asked her what she wanted people to understand about her story. Hannah looked directly into the camera, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular authority of someone who had stopped trying to be invisible. "Not all heroes wear capes," she said simply. "Some wear scrubs." The video went viral within hours. It accumulated 38 million views in 4 days. Messages flooded in from veteran healthcare workers across the country, nurses, respiratory therapists, radiology techs, surgeons, anesthesiologists, people who'd walked away from military service, hid their combat history, changed their names, changed their lives, changed everything to escape the weight of what they'd seen and what they'd survived. They started coming forward. They started reclaiming their identities. They started wearing their stories like Hannah wore those boots, not as a burden, but as proof of survival. 1 week after the Rose Garden ceremony, Hannah walked through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial wearing her Director of Trauma Services nameplate for the first time. The staff lined the hallway, nurses, technicians, orderlies, many of them veterans themselves, and they saluted her. Not as a submissive gesture, but as recognition. As welcome. Captain Marcus Webb was waiting in her new office. Behind his desk, on the wall, he'd hung a single photograph, Hannah and the 8-year-old boy in Ramadi, 2004. She was carrying him out of the rubble. His face was buried in her neck. Her uniform was covered in dust and blood, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who would move heaven and earth to keep this child alive. "We're going to make this hospital better," Webb said simply. Hannah nodded. She removed her jacket and hung it carefully on the back of her chair. Through the window, Houston sprawled out beneath them, all those lives moving through their days, unaware that they were being protected by people who'd already sacrificed everything. The quiet heroes. The invisible warriors. The ones who simply showed up and did the work because that was what needed to be done. Across town, in a strip mall between a cell phone store and a tax preparation office, Dr. Sterling sat at a folding table selling supplemental insurance policies to disinterested shoppers. His medical degree hung on the wall behind him, gathering dust, a relic of a career that no longer existed. The policies weren't selling well. Most people didn't want to talk to him long enough to hear the pitch. His phone buzzed with a news alert. He saw Hannah's name and didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew what he'd lost. If you made it this far, you understand now what happens when you underestimate the quiet ones. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength, and comment below, have you ever been completely wrong about someone's true identity? Hannah's journey from invisible nurse to decorated hero is the kind of truth that changes how we see the people around us.